Welcome to the GSMC Business News Podcast, the show dedicated to keeping you up to date on all things concerning business, technology, and the stock market. Get a head start on the day as we keep you updated on the latest goings-on Wall Street, money, jobs, and technology. If you're looking for a podcast to keep you informed and ahead of the game in business, the GSMC Business News Podcast has you covered.
Welcome to the GSMC Business News Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Paula DuPont, and tonight, in talking about business news, there are a number of topics that we're going to cover. The first of which being comments that the Federal Reserve Chairman had made and its effect on the markets in the middle of this week. We're also going to talk about how consumer products are looking at marketing trends from previous recessions and economic downturns to look at what it might do in the current situation. We'll talk about how renewable energy, for the first time since it has existed, has now surpassed coal in terms of meeting power needs, which is significant in terms of reducing carbon emissions. We're going to talk about low tech in Japan, the very country that is probably the epitome of high tech. We're going to talk about infrared cameras and how they're being used to detect the coronavirus. And finally, we're going to talk about genetic research companies that typically do ancestry, lineage type research, are now turning to their members to gather information that might be helpful in detecting who is more susceptible or more likely to survive coronavirus. So more on that in the show up ahead. Not a stock market, Wall Street type expert by any means, but I don't think you have to be one to know that during this time where there's been, pretty much daily negative headlines, the market doesn't seem to align real well with that. I mean, in a good way, stocks have done better in recent days and weeks overall, largely, I would say, despite sometimes, some real negative news. Like, for instance, every Thursday we get the new numbers for unemployment claims, and it just keeps getting higher and higher. In fact, I'm not even going to talk about that today because it's just more of the same, and you can get that information elsewhere. But nonetheless, we've had headlines like that, and yet the market has done well. Now, sometimes it's believed that the market has done well because it's buoyed by some of the developments in vaccines and in treatments. At least, progress being made that's reported on by different companies. It seems several different large pharmaceutical firms have taken their turns reporting that they're in a new trial period, human trials for their vaccine or treatments. And then you saw the market respond positively to the announcement that remdesivir was approved by the FDA and fast-tracked so that it could be used to help reduce the amount of time that people suffered with coronavirus. So in this segment, I just wanted to mention what seems to finally perhaps align better or be what we would expect. It's not good news, but at least it seems there's again some alignment between the headlines, the realities, I guess, and the market. And it comes from on Wednesday, May 13th, the Federal Reserve Chairman, Jerome Powell, had said that further stimulus could be needed to support the economy's recovery from the coronavirus-induced contraction. Now, as a result, although blue chip stocks and the S&P 500 had opened modestly low on that day, throughout the day, things just seemed to decline. The Dow Industrials dropped nearly 700 points at their low periods. The declines were broad, with 29 of the 30 stocks in the index in the red, along with all 11 sectors of the S&P 500. That's kind of interesting because it seems like the tech sector overall has been doing much better, largely. Shares of beaten down energy, airline, and bank stocks were among the biggest decliners. And this, by the way, that particular fact is according to a Wall Street Journal article on this. So a number of industries were affected by that news yesterday, although that needing more stimulus money, I don't think was necessarily a new message for the market to hear, because we have also been hearing that the Democrats were coming up with another package to propose for more stimulus aid to help with the economy and to help with workers. And in fact, I believe it was the same day that what their proposal was, or the bill was announced. So it goes to the Senate, where it's likely going to face some resistance there based on other things that have been said. So I know I'm grossly whitewashing that whole discussion because I just don't want to go down that road. But what I'm saying is that the message about this stimulus needed coming from the federal chair was perhaps the jolt that took the market by surprise. And it was kind of a sobering message. Incidentally, on Thursdays, stocks came back a bit, but not obviously to the level they were prior to that downturn. So we know overall, as we go through this day to day, the market's going to really fluctuate, and there just doesn't seem to be a whole lot of rhyme or reason to it of what news that the market reacts to. But it, we know that there's no way we can say right now we're in a pattern because it's just been changing so much. Now, overall, I believe with the economy, where it was said earlier on when this first took hold that we would likely see a V-shaped recovery where the economy the rate at which it was declining would be the same rate at which it would sharply come back. And now many are backing away from that idea and are saying it could be something more like a swoosh, like the Nike swoosh, where it'll take a longer period of time, obviously, for that increase, but a steady, continued increase in the economy. Hopefully that's the case, but, no one really does know, right? So that's all I have to say about that. That was a very poor reference to Forrest Gump. Sorry about that. So in our next segment after this commercial, we're going to talk about how companies are responding to the market trends that they'd seen in previous economic downturns and using that right now to help plan for their product lines and promotions. So more on that after this commercial.
You really can't underestimate the importance of having the right creative work for your brand or your product. Whether it's a logo, a website, a book cover, or an ad campaign, you really need a quality design to make that big difference pop and deliver your overall engagement and success in a competitive market. That's where Design Crowd comes in. Design Crowd has over 750,000 designers from Sydney to San Francisco ready to help you with awesome creative ideas. They make crowdsourcing work for you. So if you need a logo or you're working on your creative branding, you can go to designcrowd.com and post a brief describing the design you need. And then within about 2 to 7 days, you'll receive up to over 100 different designs from designers around the world. Then you pick the best design and approve payment to the designer. So you're only paying for the design that you want. It takes a lot of the guesswork out of freelancing and out of crowdsourcing. And you don't have to be a huge company like Harvard Business School to use Design Crowd, although they have used it as well. You can start a project on Design Crowd for as little as $99. And if you go right now to designcrowd.com/health and wellness or enter the promo code health and wellness on their website, then our health and wellness listeners will receive up to $150 off of your design project. That's designcrowd.com/health and wellness or entering that promo code health and wellness.
Are you looking for a podcast that gives you all of the latest news from the world of finance? Then check out the GSMC Financial News Podcast. We'll delve into the ups and downs of the stock market, changes in the economy, and news from the world of real estate and technology. From breaking news on the New York Stock Exchange, NASDAQ, or the overseas market, to updates on the bond market, if there's money to be made, we'll cover it on the GSMC Financial News Podcast.
I read an article recently that talked about how consumer product companies are looking at some lessons learned and techniques that they saw back in the last economic downturn, which was in 2009, and how they're applying some of that to their approach right now, which as we know, consumer spending is down pretty significantly right now. And the circumstances right now for people buying products is quite different. They don't have as much access to things as previously. So kind of different circumstances, but the issue is still about how do you keep your customers loyal to your brand during a time when unemployment is high, there's great uncertainty, concerns about safety and going to a store to get some of these products, having to buy them online. There's all kinds of issues. And one of them actually that was pointed out in the article is you have some companies who, on one hand, are scrambling to try to meet the surging demand for household essentials, and at the same time trying to operate their factories at a lower capacity in order to keep workers from getting sick and to keep them socially distanced. And so it's quite a challenge there that probably was not felt before here in this country. So some differences there. But some of the things that companies are doing to adapt to the circumstances, Nestle was cited in this article. Nestle, being one of the biggest packaged foods maker, is rolling out new, more affordable pack sizes for some of their products. At the same time, another company, Mondelez International, which makes Oreo cookies, They are focusing on a narrower range of their product line for those that are the most top-selling products. And then you have other companies who aren't necessarily repackaging or narrowing their product line, but are positioning their products differently for the consumer. And I'm talking about Kellogg Company, which is exploring marketing to convey how many meals a single box of cereal can provide. So I thought that was kind of interesting, because I don't think of cereal in terms of meals and feeding a family of 4 or whatever, but I suppose it is how you look at it, and for some people that is a viable meal option. Of course it is for breakfast. We think of that. I guess in my mind I thought meal and went to dinner, but in any case. So there's some interesting trends, going on, and companies have to think differently of how they're going to market products and which ones they're going to focus on, especially if they have to consider some capacity constraints for their factories. The outlook is not great in terms of consumer spending coming back, as we've talked about before. And in fact, the International Monetary Fund has forecast that the world economy would shrink by 3% this year. And that's compared with a 0.1% contraction in 2009. So with that, of course, that's heavily influenced by consumer spending. So we're not expecting consumer spending to do real well, even though we've seen in some of the quarterly reports that have come out from some consumer companies, as well as grocery stores and others who, Target and Walmart, who sell groceries along with other things, other essentials. Some of them are doing well, but where it comes to individual products, that's another story, and how they're doing, and particularly talking about those stores doing well. A lot of them saw, a huge uptick, a surge in spending at the beginning of the pandemic, when people were trying to, hoard things and get all the toilet paper that they needed and stock up. And that has since fallen off. Still increased spending, but not what it was back in March. And even early April. So some of that has dropped off. But companies are looking at these different tactics. And for instance, back in 2009, you had companies doing things like Pepsi tailored promotions to paycheck cycles. So they would push large multi-packs of snacks near the start of the month, and smaller packs later on, after finding that people had less cash towards the end of the month overall. During that same time period, you also had companies taking other approaches, like Procter & Gamble launched a different version of its Tide laundry detergent that was 20% cheaper. As a way to appeal to consumers. Now you have companies like Nestle, which is looking to roll out single-serve packets of its chicken seasoning, and they're going to put that out in Indonesia, which is the first time they've done something like that. And you have Kellogg, Procter & Gamble, and Coca-Cola are also considering packaging to put products within reach of consumers' budgets. So while you have some that are focusing on making more affordable products and retooling them to do that, to make them more affordable for people, On the other hand, you also have this other phenomenon where there's some loyalty to more premium products. Recently, Nestle reported strong first quarter growth in their premium brands like Nespresso and San Pellegrino in the United States. And they said that, while, again, some customers want something affordable, others want the premium. So they're trying to look at both sides of that. I wonder too now, with the unemployment rate so high and people, getting their unemployment payments on a certain schedule, if we'll see consumer products lining up with that. I'm not sure how that would work, but it's definitely a time to be creative if you're marketing for consumer products. So we are going to take another break for commercial, and when we come back, we're going to talk about renewable energy.
You really can't underestimate the importance of having the right creative work for your brand or your product. Whether it's a logo, a website, a book cover, or an ad campaign, you really need a quality design to make that big difference pop and deliver your overall engagement and success in a competitive market. That's where Design Crowd comes in. Design Crowd has over 750,000 designers from Sydney to San Francisco ready to help you with awesome creative ideas. They make crowdsourcing work for you. So if you need a logo or you're working on your creative branding, you can go to designcrowd.com and post a brief describing the design you need. And then within about 2 to 7 days, you'll receive up to over 100 different designs from designers around the world. Then you pick the best design and approve payment to the designer. So you're only paying for the design that you want. It takes a lot of the guesswork out of freelancing and out of crowdsourcing. And you don't have to be a huge company like Harvard Business School to use Design Crowd, although they have used it as well. You can start a project on Design Crowd for as little as $99. And if you go right now to designcrowd.com/health and wellness or enter the promo code health and wellness on their website, then our health and wellness listeners will receive up to $150 off of your design project. That's designcrowd.com/health and wellness or entering that promo code health and wellness.
Do you work in the world of marketing and advertising? Are you a media buyer or the owner of an agency? Have you been looking for a podcast to help stay on top of all the goings-on of those worlds? The GSMC Marketing News Podcast is dedicated to keeping you up to date on all things concerning marketing and advertising. Get the latest marketing news, from what major businesses have planned for the coming year, to the newest trends in advertising, from podcasts, digital and streaming, to the old standbys of radio, television, and billboards. The GSMC Marketing News Podcast has you covered, whether you're a marketing agent or a business trying to expand your brand.
By now, you may have seen some of the social media posts or memes that show the planet Earth as exhaling and finally calming down in this period of time where we are working differently, we're spending differently, we're living differently. And it's had this big impact on the planet in terms of emissions that are in the atmosphere, pollution in general. There's fewer traffic accidents because fewer people are on the road. And of course, there's the whole upside to that of getting refunds from car insurance companies because of that. But with all those kinds of things, one other phenomenon that goes with that right now is the change in the electricity industry. Some of that being influenced by the pandemic, and some of it maybe just coincidental or a result of many different factors and just timing. But I thought it was interesting. I saw an article saying that the United States is on track to produce more electricity this year from renewable power than from coal for the first time on record. And that a transformation, partly driven by the coronavirus pandemic, has had profound implications in the fight against climate change. The milestone of renewable energy surpassing coal in terms of producing power is quite dramatic, considering that a decade ago, coal provided nearly half of the nation's electricity. So you had nuclear power and coal as the big power providers at that time. And then somewhere along the way, more than 10 years ago, about 10 years ago, you started to have more renewable energy firms starting to ramp up, big solar farms, wind farms, a lot of activity from that. And there were some government incentives that helped provide production tax credits and other things that helped to stimulate more renewable power. But at the time, it was not seen as something viable that would ever surpass coal. Coal, after all, is cheap, and a lot of it is produced here in this country, thanks to the mining industry. And so it just didn't seem likely that this kind of time would come when renewable would surpass. Now, also factor into this natural gas. Natural gas has made a dramatic entrance. It's always been around, but when natural gas became more abundant because of fracking and more shale reserves being tapped in order to extract the natural gas, it became abundant and cheap. And so more natural gas-fired electricity plants were built. And now finally you have that coupled with the fact that more companies have been shuttering their coal plants because of all of the restrictions and other factors too. But because of the CO2 emissions standards that are in place. And I'm going way down a road here, and the point initially is that you have lower electricity demand overall, and you have more renewable energy being able to meet that demand. So the result being you have far less emissions because of coal in the atmosphere. And, as I said, when you've seen these memes or social media posts about it, or even articles about that, it's also due as well to, factories, some factories in the world that produce carbon emissions. They have not been running. And you also have less traffic on the roads, and traffic, of course, cars on the road is a big contributor to carbon emissions as well. So it's not solely because of coal and the lack of it that carbon emissions have gone down. But consider that overall energy demand has gone down. It's funny, this time of year, every year, typically power companies will put out a statement saying, based on the weather forecast and their own projections and on usage, that they know how much power they're going to need at peak, at the ultimate time during the summer months when power demand would be the highest, and that they are usually saying that they're well positioned to handle that no matter what it would be. And so, power companies have to have all the power lined up to make sure that it does meet demand no matter what it is. It'll be interesting to see what some of those statements look like this year, however, because demand is really, really low. In fact, what I read was that the International Energy Agency expects the biggest decline in electricity consumption since the Great Depression. It is as if Germany and France were both turned off for the year. And that's pretty significant. And the issue here is that with consumption down, power companies, they will typically use the cheaper electricity first to meet needs, and then as demand increases and more power is needed, they will then go to the other costlier forms of energy. In this case, where coal is, being surpassed by renewable, we don't have the kind of demand that requires using any type of electricity when so much cheaper renewable is available. And in fact, one thing that I saw was that in just the first 4.5 months of this year, America's fleet of wind turbines, solar panels, and hydroelectric dams have produced more electricity than coal on 90 separate days, shattering last year's record of 38 days for the entire year. On May 1st in Texas, wind power alone supplied nearly 3 times as much electricity as coal did. So now that coal prices are up, it's just not being used as much. And one of the things that first of all, it's been a trend that companies have closed their coal-producing plants, or some of them, as part of their larger fleet. But now in this situation, depending on how far it goes and if the projections around power use continue, you could have a situation where more coal plants are being shut down. And basically, once they're shut down, they're really difficult to restart again if that's seen as something needed later. According to statistics about how much renewable is available, I don't know. We're gonna have to see what happens with that. So we are going to take another break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about Japan and how they've had to drop some of their low-tech ways to compete in the high-tech world.
Hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Hi, we're back. And I'll just speak for myself and say that I was surprised to learn that the country that I consider to be one of the big innovators in the world, and one that is one of the most tech-savvy countries, Japan, with Panasonic and Toyota and a whole host of other companies that have, been on the forefront of cutting edge in a lot of ways, that they are very much rooted in tradition. I guess that part isn't surprising, the tradition aspect that's woven into their business. But I guess just the fact that they still used fax machines and stamps and things to validate papers, physical papers, that they relied upon to do business. And naturally, you can see the rub with our current environment and the social distancing factor and trying to prevent the spread of disease. They are having to adapt from ways that they've done things in Japan in order to still try to honor their traditions, but at the same time, be able to adapt to this corona work world. For instance, Panasonic Corporation, which will release its latest results next week, will do something different than it ever has, in that it won't hand out the stapled papers that it does usually to the members that come out for the meeting and who are encouraged to come out to the Tokyo or Osaka locations for the results meeting. Instead, they are going to basically do an earnings conference call, which a lot of companies have been doing for a long time anyway. But this, for them, that's a big switch. And that's just one of the things that they've had to adapt to the times. Another big challenge for them is in using, getting signatures on paperwork, and also using these official stamps that I guess provide some authority to different papers. And they're used a lot. And so they've had to get around doing that. And a lot of what they've been doing is using companies like DocuSign, which allows you to do this electronically and have it secure, basically. And that's being used quite a bit. But there are areas where that's just evidently not enough, and they're having a hard time adapting to that. One person from an online travel firm had said that we've digitized what we could, but there are still so many things that we haven't been able to change. And, when it comes to obviously, contracts and invoices, there are some who won't accept invoices without this official stamp on it. So they're still trying to work through that. And by the way, that's also a big challenge for those in real estate, apparently, because landlords like the security of a physical stamp on a rental contract, along with a piece of paper from the federal government that certifies the renter. So that's a big issue. But other companies have been adapting around the stamp and around their traditional ways of meeting or delivering results. Toyota, for example, held its first online-only news conference to report results recently. They did that through Zoom, and they were able to take reporters' calls through Zoom, which I think is kind of interesting. I wonder how that works. Apparently it does, because it's done often. Japan as a country has had relatively few cases and deaths from the coronavirus. But at the same time, they're taking it very seriously, and they had called for companies to allow their employees to work at home wherever possible. So, have people like the cosmetics maker Shiseido. They have 90% of their employees are working from home. And that includes 11,000 beauty consultants who normally staff the department store counters. And by the way, this opportunity for employees to work at home has proven successful for some of the companies there who otherwise were very conservative and wanted people to be in the office, and some now are actually considering continuing that practice of having people work from home. So, it sounds like they still have to work through some other things. This reliance on this stamp on actual paper contracts is something that some companies are still very much holding on to. But they're looking at building extra fees in order to issue these stamps and produce these materials, because there's going to be more involved now in getting them circulated. So, interesting times in Japan. We are going to take another break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about infrared cameras and how they are being used to help detect if people are infected with the coronavirus. So more on that when we come back from this commercial break.
Are you tired of the same old news? Are you sick of the seemingly endless political spin and negativity? The GSMC America Still Beautiful podcast is a weekly news podcast covering all the top positive and uplifting news stories. We cover stories that will inspire, uplift, and remind you of the good in the world. Tune into the Golden State Media Concepts America Still Beautiful podcast to get all the great and positive news stories of today. Download the GSMC America Still Beautiful podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Right now, the business world, as well as local governments and state governments, are still trying to come up with surefire answers as to how they can reopen and ensure the safety to their visitors, to customers, to employees returning back out there in the world. And there hasn't been a definitive method yet found that's perfect and that it can assure or provide all the assurances needed. And of course, part of the problem is this incubation period when people can be infected and not know it, and just by entering into a building bring that threat with them. And whether or not it can be detected early on before a person is symptomatic, I mean, that's the issue. Now, companies have had to come up with their best possible solution, knowing it's not perfect already, in places where they've had to be open because they're a life-sustaining business, or perhaps they just got the flag to reopen back up. So people are taking their best guess, basically, and making considerable investments, too, in order to make the environment safe. So I saw an article recently in Wired magazine talking about infrared cameras and how they can spot a fever. and it's a way to do it non-invasively as people would come and go from a building. And it gives different examples of how it's being used. It talks about a community hospital in Los Angeles where anyone traveling into this hospital must pass through this screening area where they have an infrared camera installed. And the infrared camera determines heat. It can determine if someone has a fever or not. And someone would be monitoring a display of the people's faces as they were scanned. And if there is a green box around the person's face, it means that their temperature is less than 100 degrees Fahrenheit. If it has a red box, it means their temperature is 100 or more, and they can then pull that person aside and, do additional screening. However, I don't think that it's mandatory or that if someone is obliged to leave or to do further testing if they are pulled aside. That hadn't really been addressed in this article. But the idea is that they spent about $20,000 to get this camera set up and the monitoring system, and develop this questionnaire for people who do get flagged to be pulled aside. And, they feel that it's an effective way for them to somewhat manage whether or not there's a spread of the virus. Now, other companies have been using it already, like Amazon uses infrared cameras on their workers at warehouses and also at Whole Foods grocery stores. Apple has said that it will use something like that, or they will check employees and customers, their temperatures, as they come into the stores when they reopen them. So you can see what the attraction is to using this technology, which allows more people to be looked at the same time, particularly in a place that gets a lot of traffic, a lot of people in and out. It makes sense. Now, the article points out that the FDA says infrared thermometers and cameras can be an accurate way to check for a fever. But temperature checkpoints may not provide much protection from COVID-19 in workplaces or other venues, even when combined with health questionnaires. Countries that had set up checkpoints at ports to screen for fevers or other symptoms during SARS, Ebola, and swine flu outbreaks had little success at keeping it out. And the problem is that it's not seen as a real effective way, temperature screening that is, to really detect this COVID-19. It's so much bigger. And part of the problem is the incubation period of up to 14 days between when a person being infected with the coronavirus and that person shows any symptoms. So during that time, someone may be able to transmit the virus, and when they don't know that they are infected. So that's pretty discouraging fact here when we're trying to manage this. Evidence suggests that up to half of patients don't show symptoms detectable by screening, although more research is needed. A person with a fever can slip past a temperature check by taking fever-reducing medicine, like ibuprofen. For this reason, that's why some institutions or places deliberately won't use infrared cameras because they feel it gives a false sense of security. That when people see this system in place, they think everything's okay and they're safe to go visit, and particularly when you talk about nursing homes and, opening them up to visitors. And people may not be as diligent then in taking whatever other measures are necessary to make sure that they're safe in not transmitting the virus further. There was a review of 15 years of previous studies on screening at international borders that found that checking for fevers or other symptoms such as a cough were ineffective at detecting cases during the SARS epidemic, as well as swine flu and Ebola. Pretty discouraging information, and that's how you can see where this gets, past borders and travels from country to country, because it's really nearly impossible to see where this helps. I guess the bigger question is this better than nothing, or does there need to be a very clear understanding that this is one methodology and that other social distancing steps have to be taken by those, of course, entering a place, but also by the companies too, and still doing things like limiting the number of people that can be in an elevator, putting directional arrows and shapes on the floor to show what's a 6-foot distance. Some companies are using, putting markers or signs on different desks and cubicles to show that no one is to occupy them, in order to restrict the number of people that are in a location. When it comes to hospitals and nursing homes, I'm not sure how they're going to get around it. I think there already are a lot of very strong safety precautions that are being taken. But, now that visitors will be allowed to go into hospitals and be able to have other elective procedures, there's definitely has to be other measures put into place. But back to the infrared cameras, although the studies have indicated that they may not be so effective in preventing the spread of COVID, there is the perception issue, and the fact that if people see this type of equipment, that at least there's a sense that the company or institution is taking it seriously, and that's one line of defense. It's not going to be the ultimate, but it's one line of defense. And apparently they are still being purchased on a wide scale, and revenues have been up for companies that do make these cameras. So there is a demand for them. It's just that we're going to have to continue looking for some other ways to detect the virus or stop it. Duh, right? I'm not saying anything we don't all know. Well, we are going to take another break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about Ancestry.com and 23andMe and what they're doing in terms of taking a closer look at genes and what role they may play in the coronavirus.
The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast, the show that gives you advice on everything travel. We explore places you've always wanted to go, as well as giving tips for traveling in those places. We'll give you advice on the best sites for travel tips, information, and discounts. Join us as we travel the world, explore cultures, and meet new people. The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast has got you covered. Download the GSMC Travel Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
A couple years ago, I was curious and I did one of those DNA tests to see what my ancestry was. Now, I'm not adopted. I know that my mom and her family came. My mom didn't come from Ireland, but her family did, her parents, and strong, long line of Irish people on her side. And my father was French Canadian, long line of connections back to France, and so there wasn't any big mystery that I was trying to solve, and I wasn't trying to see if I had a secret sister or brother out there somewhere or something. I thought, well, maybe there'll be something interesting that'll turn up that I didn't realize. And sure enough, I got the results, and I was really surprised to see that there were several things that came up that I hadn't heard of at all, of how they were connected to me. Little bit of Native American in Southwest United States area and Mexico. Had some lineage from there. A little bit of Jewish heritage, tiny bit of Spanish, German, and all these other things. And these were all very small percentages, and the bulk of what I knew was true, of course, that the Irish and French side. And then about, I don't know, maybe not even a year later, I got an update that said, "Oh, we ran the numbers differently, and you're not Jewish anymore. You're not Native American." And all the other things were sort of pulled away, and I was back to being what I thought I was to begin with. So I was a little disappointed. I started getting into all that and studying up on my possible relatives from afar. The point is that, these ancestry tests have become very popular, and a lot of us get curious and think, well, maybe there's something in the past that even our parents aren't aware of. And so you do that. And consequently, they have millions of members like us who've done the same thing. So with that, and when I signed up to have my DNA analyzed, I had the option to be part of their studies, their research studies. And as is every member who signs up, you have that option. Well, now some of the companies, 23andMe in particular, is trying to look at those members who may have been hospitalized with COVID or were very sick with it, to step forward and allow for their DNA to be used in a study to determine if there is any link with DNA, and to see if certain people with certain backgrounds are more predisposed to getting something like COVID, or whether they have something in their genes that might make them better able to shake it off and outlive it, or have, not as serious symptoms of it. So they had sent out a questionnaire to their members asking, for anyone who has been hospitalized for it, if they would want to participate in this study. They also reached out and said that they would do free genetic testing for 10,000 people, or actually they've had 10,000 people sign up to get this free genetic testing because they meet the criteria for having had coronavirus. So very interesting that they're doing this. Now, it's still early on. And I mentioned before, or alluded to the fact that other ones like Ancestry.com is also doing something similar. However, they are looking to use the information that they collect to offer it to a qualified researcher who, has a viable study that they are doing to be able to use that data. Now, it all sounds kind of scary, like, could somebody take your information without your knowledge and use it? This is all voluntary. This is people who want to offer that information up. And so far, they don't have enough people who have participated and have sent in their DNA to be analyzed in order to really draw some big conclusions. I saw an interview on TV today with someone from 23andMe, and she had said that they do have some hypotheses about the role of genes with the coronavirus, but nothing right now that they could substantiate or put out there yet, because there isn't enough data. So I guess they have about 900 samples so far, and there have been no significant genetic hits yet. So I guess we'll see, as time goes on. I don't think, they're anywhere close to competing with what some of the other drug manufacturers are looking at in terms of actually studying and doing trials on treatment and vaccines, where, genetics would then play some major role. So we'll see what happens with that. But, I just can't help but feel that there's got to be some information that can be derived from this huge database of DNA. I mean, maybe we don't have enough yet, or we don't have it from the right people in terms of studying this virus, but it seems that there's so much information that can be derived or extracted from DNA that at some point in the future, and maybe we just need more time, hopefully not more people infected with the coronavirus. We don't want that to be the case in terms of getting more information, but at least, getting more from the people who have had it already. So it seems an important piece of this whole puzzle that has yet to be really fully explored. So that brings us to the end of today's podcast. I want to thank you for joining me on the GSMC Business News Podcast on the GSMC Podcast Network. Please go to wherever it is you listen to your podcasts and subscribe to this one. And also, please leave comments on our Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram pages. Thanks so much for joining me. Have a good night.
You've been listening to the GSMC Business News Podcast, part of the GSMC Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type GSMC into your favorite podcast app to find all of the shows from the GSMC Podcast Network. From movies to music, from sports to entertainment, from business news to weird news. Please subscribe to the podcast and follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's podcast.